I'm with Dr. Peter Cooper, who gained his PhD in philosophy, but essentially studying Victorian church history. Peter was born in 1937. He gained his degree at Selwyn College, Cambridge, but before that, his memories of Sudbury and the process by which he got to Cambridge are really extremely interesting. Peter, tell us about your early education, where you first went to school.
Well, it was during the war, and so it must have, if I was born in 1937, it must have started in 1942. And there was a little private school in a bungalow in Potkiln Road in Great Cornwall, kept by a lady called Mrs. King, who was rather mysterious in a way. Not even her own family seemed to know when she was born. And she had some connection with the Openshaw family, and old Mr. Openshaw had been a dentist. And Minnie King, as she was known, was married to a man called Stanley King, who was a lovely laid-back character, and a member of the King family who kept a grocer's shop at the end of Gainsborough Street, a few yards from where we are now. Never quite sure what Stanley King did. He did a milk round amongst other things. But it was quite a nice little place. There weren't many children there. The Kings had a daughter called Sheila, who was still very much around. She lives in Acton. My memory is that it was £0.50 a week, and you had to take your £0.50 in with you first thing Monday morning, and then when you had paid in your £0.50, the teaching and learning could begin. And I have a strange memory of my first day there, because, for heaven's sake, I was only 5 years old, and my memory is that I walked from our house in the Beers Road all by myself to this school,
and it was
halfway up Potkiln Road.
And it was like a dame's school?
It's a bit like a dame's school. And then on that first day, I remember it very well, I met another little boy coming from the opposite direction, and his name was Roger Hall, and his father was Stanley Hall, who was one of the directors of Rose Insurance Company in Melford. I mean, lots of people around here knew Stanley Hall, and we're still very good friends, actually. He now lives in Guernsey. Want me to say some more?
No, you then went to Cornard Primary School.
Cornard Primary School, yes, which is still there. I think it's now some sort of social centre. And I don't think that had changed much since the reign of Queen Victoria. And I remember it was heated by these extraordinary old-fashioned Victorian coal stoves. And at the end of the main classroom, on one side of the end wall was a portrait of Queen Mary, and on the other side there was a portrait of King George V. And the headmaster was a rather emotionally charged gentleman called Lionel Hurst. And I was there for 2 years. And then I went to another private school in not far from here, the Limes in Friar Street, which was run by a lovely lady called Enid Marsland, who bred Cocker Spaniels. And it really was a very nice place, actually. I enjoyed it. And soon after I'd left, who should turn up as one of the teachers but Minnie King, who'd abandoned her own educational establishment in Great Cornwall. And I failed my 11 plus from there. So and then went 2 years at the modern secondary.
Yes. Peter, this is the...
I'm leaping ahead, yes.
Interesting bit that...
Is it?
You clearly enjoyed being at the Limes.
Yes.
And it perhaps fostered an interest in history or English.
Well, I enjoyed it because I wasn't required to do anything energetic. I wasn't required to play football or anything like that, and there was no physical activity at all. but it was all sort of rather concentrated learning, and I did enjoy it. I think I learned a lot there. Yes. Didn't get me through the 11 plus, but there we are.
So in those days, Peter, at the age of 11 or just before, you took an exam called the 11 plus.
That's right.
And if you passed it, you went to the grammar school. If you failed, you went to the secondary modern.
That's right, which was on the site of, St Gregory's Middle School.
Right. And at the secondary modern, did you feel that you were not being intellectually fulfilled, or were you too...
Well, I did for the first few weeks. I was sort of very happy there, and I realised I wasn't learning very much. There were some good teachers there, actually. I don't think they had the recognition that they ought to have had. But I think, by the time I was 12 or 13, I was saying to myself, well, schooling is nothing but sort of 15 years penal servitude, and I must knuckle down and get on with it and see what happens in life. But when I went there, I was put in the A stream. They thought I might conceivably have a bit of a brain, and then it was decided that I didn't, so they put me in the B stream, one down. And then they decided that I was a far worse case than they had imagined, so I was just about to be put in the C stream. And my mother, who was an abrasive character, if ever there was one, went and terrorised the headmaster and demanded that I be allowed to take the 11 plus again, which, I did. Well, I've never known whether I really passed it or not, because everybody who... There were 4 of us from the secondary school who retook it, and 4 boys, and 2 of us were told we had passed, and the other 2 were told they had failed. And quite honestly, I think they were very bright. I mean, it was a gross injustice to them. And so when I say I don't know whether I passed or not, what I mean is that the 2 of us who were told that we had passed were then summoned to interview at what was then the girls' high school. And that was an extraordinary affair. The headmaster, there was a panel of people, the chief education officer, the headmistress of the girls' high school, who was Miss Sargent, and the headmaster of the grammar school, who was a man called Martin. And all I remember about it is being given a book, I don't know, it was a novel or something like that, with a story in it, and I was asked to read a paragraph, and I was asked to say what country was depicted in the paragraph. And I said, I think it's Hungary. So that I got a mark for that. It was Hungary. I can't remember what the book was. But since then, I think this interview was all about judging whether you had a right middle-class accent or not, which was dreadful, really. I mean, the whole system of this 11 plus and the way in which children were separated into, sheep and goats were absolutely iniquitous. The people who were involved in it weren't. I mean, there were good teachers everywhere. But after, we got to the end of the Second World War, and there was this awful system of the 11 plus, and the idea that a child's future should be settled when he or she was simply 11. When you were 11, you had 2 days of examinations, and I did these examinations, I remember, at the grammar school. The idea that it should be this way, and those 2 days at the age of 11 should decide your future is absolutely dreadful, wasn't it? So anyway, I went to the grammar school, and then I was put 2 years behind where I should have been because I'd missed so much schooling.
When you went to the grammar school, Peter, you would have had to have a uniform and other accoutrements.
Yes, didn't mind that.
No, and you felt at home and comfortable there. You didn't...
Well, it was... The other boy too was in the same sort of situation. The other boy was in fact John Davy, whose mother married the deputy head of the grammar school. You would know old Ted Angelbeck, wouldn't you?
Yes. Yeah.
And he sort of had a more difficult time than I did in a way, because his mother married the deputy head.
Yes.
And I think that made him feel a bit awkward. We're still very good friends, but we were allowed to do sort of the minimum of subjects. I mean, we didn't do, I don't know what we were. We did the minimum number of subjects for A-level GCE, and I remember, that, there wasn't any physics at that time. There was chemistry. We weren't allowed to do that.
Peter, I take it at the time, many people at the grammar school were there because their parents could afford for them
No,
to
that
go.
system had finished.
That had finished.
I mean, now when I went to grammar school, it's 1950. So the boys who were there, I don't think there were any boys who paid fees.
Right.
I can't remember what I was going. I'd missed 2 years, and I was 2 years behind. So the various things they said you can't do, you haven't got time. Well, then eventually I missed the 5th form and went from the 4th form into the 6th form. And for O-level GCE, as it was called, I did an extra subject that the school didn't recognise, and that was music. And then when I did A-levels, I did Latin, English and history, according to the grammar school, but I also did music again on the side. So in those days, the standard number of A-levels was 3.
Yes.
And I did a 4th privately, which wasn't recognised by the school, except that by the time I came to do my A-levels and was taking music, we had an excellent headmaster called James McClellan, who you probably remember, and who was an excellent man, and he insisted that the county authorities pay my fees. So I did one extra A-level and got the same marks as everybody else in the other subjects, which I did with the recognition of the school. So actually Sudbury Grammar School was a very good school. And in its way, well, the modern secondary was too when I went there. I think I can say that through my school career in Sudbury and Cornard, I can't remember a single teacher I would have regarded as a poor teacher.
When you were at the secondary school, you have memories of stone picking and...
Oh, that's right. Yes, you see, well, they said of me, this boy hasn't got a brain, he must play plenty of football and do plenty of carpentry and gardening. And there were only 2 things I remember about gardening. That was at the old sort of modern secondary science centre, which was opposite the old girls' high school. And there was the gardening teacher was a nice man called Mr. Bond, who had a university degree. Actually, most of them didn't at the modern secondary at those days. And I remember doing 2 things. One was putting a handful of earth in a test tube and shaking it up to see how it settled, so that you had some idea of the strata of the soil. And the other was stone picking, because all the ground around this building was very rough. And I remember the boys being lined up and told to move across this field, each one with a bucket, putting stones in this bucket. And I remember the headmaster of the modern secondary in those days was a lovely old chap called Stanley Fitch, who was a Quaker and had a lovely mop of white hair. And he came along and said, "That's right, boy, pick away, pick away. When you have picked up all the stones, other boys will come and grow cabbages where you have picked." And I remember saying, "Oh, sir, I am thrilled, yes, I picked with a new energy." And that's what I remember about gardening.
Yes. Coming to the grammar school, one of your teachers there was a Mr. Vinicombe?
No, Vinicombe had long since retired.
Right.
But I went in 1950, and there wasn't any music then. Vinicombe had retired, was an old man, coming up to 80, but he was my first serious piano teacher.
Yeah. So Peter, he was responsible for fostering your love of music?
No, not really. I had it before I went to Vinicombe. It was my father who sent me to Vinicombe because Vinicombe had taught him. And the Vinicombe that I knew, I mean, he's still remembered by lots of people in Sudbury. He died in 1956. He was a very accomplished musician. He had done a fellowship at the Royal College of Organists in the old-fashioned way. He didn't go to college or music school or anything like that. He did it as an apprentice organist at Exeter Cathedral, and then he eventually came to Sudbury. And I didn't really appreciate at the time what an excellent musician he was. He'd been organist at both St Gregory's and St Peter's, and for a time at the Congregational Church. And he was a dry old stick, but he really was very good. And so that's how I knew Vinicombe. The man who really knows about Vinicombe is Roger Green. He knows more than I do, but he didn't know Vinicombe. I did, and eventually he gave up private piano teaching. He lived in Acton Lane, and he gave up private piano teaching. And I think I used to go and see him occasionally after that. But the person who really, I suppose, was responsible for my interest in music was my father, who was a crazy character if ever there was one, but he was a natural musician. He was a very good jazz pianist and organ accompanist. I mean, they're two very different things, aren't they? He hadn't really had much training. He really was an extraordinary character. But I have to admit that I owe him a lot. Sort of for my love of music. And well, then Vinicombe packed up, and his wife, I think you knew his wife, didn't you? His widow, she went on to the age of 100 or more in Red House. Did you know Dora Vinicombe?
I didn't.
She had a lovely younger sister called Dorothy, and Dorothy in the 1930s had been secretary of St Leonard's Hospital, and they were a lovely pair. And they looked after old Vinicombe in his old age, and Dora lived to be 100. And I kept in touch with her. Well, then when Vinicombe finally gave up, I was taught by Claire Hills, who was a very well-known name in Sudbury. Did you know Claire Hills?
By name, yes.
You know of her?
Yes.
Or did you know her?
No, I didn't know Peter, no.
Well, she was an aunt of Michael and Edward Hills, who kept the opticians round the corner here. And she was a very well-qualified musician. She was a very, very lovely person, very good. And then I started taking piano exams, and I got distinctions, all merits in all of them. And the final piano exam that I took was grade 7. There are 8 grades. I took grade 7 and got a distinction. And then that was rather interesting because I think I took the exam in Bury St Edmunds or something, and the examiner was an old man, as I remember, sitting behind a table in the room where the piano was. I didn't know he'd already decided to give me a distinction. But as I was leaving the room, he said to me, "Do you know Mr. Vinicombe?" And I said, "Yes, he was my first piano teacher." And this old man said, "Yes, he was my first piano teacher too." Well, the old man was quite famous. In fact, he was Dr. Henry Lee, who had been organist at Christ Church in Oxford and had been presenter at Eton. And he composed a lot of church music, and if you come to if you go around the cathedrals of England, or if you go to Oxbridge colleges, you'll often hear anthems by Dr. Henry Lee. So that was, I don't know, I was rather pleased with that little experience. It was a tribute to Vinicombe that a man like Henry Lee should have thought highly of him. Well, then, sadly, in around 1973, Claire Hills died from cancer. She lived in the cottage on the corner of Key Lane and Friar Street. And she died from cancer, and I went to a lady called Greta Cockle in Melford Road, who was very, very accomplished, recital standard pianist, and her husband, Leonard Dragg, was the technical manager at Stafford Allen's.
Mm-hmm. Yes, yes. We have got to wind things up,
right.
But I will thank you again, because you have so brought to life Victorian Sudbury to me, and your book Fossils, Faith and Farming, which looks at Reverend Edwin Sidney and Little Cornard, is still available. And with that, Peter, thank you for being a historical light in the Victorian darkness for us.
Thank you for being patient.
Thank you for coming today. Thank you.